Outside, clinging to wood while the world drowned. When I first read this detail in an ancient rabbinical text, I had to stop, put the book down, because if what I was reading was actually true, then everything I thought I knew about Noah's flood was incomplete. His name was Og, King of Bashan, last of the Rephaim, a giant so massive that his iron bed, and yes, they measured it, was 13 feet long. And according to Jewish sources that predate Christianity by centuries, he didn't die in the flood, he survived it. Now I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a fantasy novel. But here's the thing that kept me up that night. Og shows up in the Bible after the flood, not as a legend, as a king, with cities, with an army. Moses himself had to fight him, and the battle was so terrifying that God had to personally tell Moses, "Do not be afraid of him." Why would Moses, who had seen the Red Sea split, who had watched Egypt collapse under 10 plagues, why would he need reassurance before facing one man, unless that man wasn't entirely human? Let me show you what I found. To understand how Og survived, you have to see what the flood was actually sent to destroy. And it wasn't just wickedness, it was something biological, Genesis 6, the chapter that sounds so mythological that most people just skip it. But read it slowly. Verse 1. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. Verse 2. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Stop right there. Sons of God. In the original Hebrew, Bene Elohim, that exact phrase shows up in Job 1:6, Job 2:1, Job 38:7, and every single time it's referring to angelic beings presenting themselves before God's throne. Not humans, not godly men, angels. And these beings crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. The Nephilim, from the Hebrew root naphal, to fall. Not giants, like your English Bible probably says, the fallen ones, those who descended, those who dragged others down with them. And here's the phrase that broke my brain when I first noticed it. And also afterward. The Nephilim were there before the flood, okay, but they were also there afterward, after the water, after the judgment, after God supposedly wiped them out completely. The text itself is telling you something survived. Now the Book of Enoch, which is directly quoted in the New Testament by Jude and preserved for 2,000 years by the Ethiopian Church, fills in what Genesis deliberately leaves out. 200 angels called the Watchers descended to Mount Hermon. Before they did anything, they made a pact. They swore an oath together so that none of them could back out later. Then they took human women as wives. The offspring? Enoch chapter 7 describes them with a level of detail that's uncomfortable. They consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. They began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This wasn't mythology, this was an ecological collapse, a contamination of the entire created order by beings from outside the system. And it spread, humans, animals, the food chain, everything. God looked at what the earth had become, and Genesis 6:6 records something that appears nowhere else in Scripture. The Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. The Hebrew word there is nachem. It doesn't mean God made a mistake. It means he saw something so broken, so far from what it was supposed to be, that even the Creator mourned, so he sent the flood. Not as punishment for lying or adultery or general human sin, as a quarantine, to cut out the genetic corruption before it consumed everything he'd made. But here's the question that launched me down this entire rabbit hole. If that's what the flood was for, how did Og survive it? The rabbis debated this for centuries, and one tradition, recorded in the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, referenced in the Midrash, offers an explanation so bizarre that most modern commentators won't even touch it. According to these sources, Og approached Noah as the waters began to rise. He didn't ask to come inside, he couldn't, his size made that physically impossible. And besides, the door had been sealed by God himself. So he made a deal. He swore to serve Noah and his descendants forever if Noah would keep him alive. And Noah, whether out of pity or pragmatism, agreed, but not by letting him in, by passing food through a small opening in the ark, while Og clung to the outside. Now, I'll be honest, when I first read that I thought, there's no way that's literal. But then I went back to the text, because whether you take this rabbinical tradition as literal history or theological metaphor, the core reality is undeniable. Og existed after the flood. That's not up for debate. He's named in Deuteronomy 3. He's described in Numbers 21. His defeat is recorded in Joshua 12. And here's the detail that made me realize this isn't just folklore. Deuteronomy 3:11 says, his bed was made of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? It was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. 9 cubits is 13 feet, 4 cubits is 6.5 feet wide. That's not poetic language, that's a measurement of a real object that people could go see for themselves. The text literally says, you don't believe me? Go to Rabbah, it's still there. Why would Moses include that kind of specific, verifiable detail unless Og was a real, physical giant of extraordinary size? And more importantly, how was he still alive 800 years after the flood if every Nephilim was supposed to have died in the water? Let me frame it another way. Numbers 13:33, 400 years after the flood. The Israelite spies enter Canaan and come back with this report. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. 400 years after the flood, the Anakim, descendants of the Nephilim, were still there, still massive, still controlling entire regions. If the flood wiped out every single Nephilim, where did these giants come from? Here's the only explanation that fits all the evidence. Something survived, either genetically, through a corrupted bloodline that made it onto the ark without Noah knowing, or physically, through beings like Og who endured the water from the outside. The contamination wasn't erased, it was just reduced, and Og became the living proof. Fast forward to Numbers 21. Israel is marching toward the Promised Land. They send messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, asking for safe passage. He refuses and attacks. Israel defeats him. Then they turn north, toward Bashan. And that's when they meet Og, verse 33. Then they turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, came out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. Now here's the detail that most people completely miss. Verse 34, But the Lord said to Moses, Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand. Do not fear him. Think about that for a second. Moses had just walked out of Egypt. He'd watched 10 plagues destroy the most powerful empire on earth. He'd seen the Red Sea split down the middle. He'd stood on Mount Sinai and spoken with God face to face. This was not a man who scared easily, but when he stood across the battlefield from Og, God had to step in and say, Don't be afraid. That tells you something about what Moses was looking at. Deuteronomy 3 gives us more. Verse 3, So the Lord our God also delivered into our hands Og king of Bashan with all his people, and we attacked him until no survivor remained. Verse 4, We took all his cities at that time. There was not a city which we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og and Bashan. 60 cities. This wasn't a warlord. This was a kingdom, an empire, built and ruled by a man who had lived through the judgment of God and come out the other side. Who built those cities? Normal-sized humans serving a giant king, or were there others like him? The text calls Og the last of the Rephaim. Rephaim, another word for the giant races. It shows up in Genesis 14, Deuteronomy 2, 2 Samuel 21. If Og was the last of them, that means there used to be more. And they survived long enough after the flood to build civilizations, raise armies and dominate civilizations, raise armies and dominate entire regions. Now imagine what that battle actually looked like. You're an Israelite soldier. You've been walking through the wilderness for 40 years. You've fought normal armies. You've won. Now you're standing on a battlefield, and across from you is a man, if you can even call him that, who's twice your height, maybe more. His armor alone weighs more than you do. His weapon is the size of a small tree. And you know, because the stories have been passed down, that this man survived the flood. The judgment that was supposed to wipe out everything like him. He's not supposed to exist, but he does. And Moses, who had seen miracles that would make your head spin, Moses needed God to tell him it was going to be okay, because Og wasn't just a giant, he was a ghost, a relic of a world that was supposed to be dead and buried under miles of water and sediment and time. And Moses had to finish what the flood started. So here's the question I've been wrestling with. If Og survived the flood, what does that actually mean about the flood itself? Most people think it was total. Complete annihilation, every living thing wiped out except what was inside the ark. But the Bible tells a more complicated story. Genesis 7:23. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. That's true. But notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say nobody survived outside the ark. It says Noah and his family were the only ones inside who lived. What if there were things outside that also made it through? Not humans, not animals in the normal sense, but beings whose hybrid nature, part angelic, part human, gave them a resilience that ordinary flesh didn't have. The Book of Enoch says that when the Nephilim's bodies died, their spirits didn't ascend or descend properly. They became trapped, disembodied, wandering the earth, hungry for habitation. What if some of them never died at all? What if the angelic component of their DNA allowed them to survive what should have killed them? That's not my theory. That's what the rabbinical sources suggest, and it's what the reappearance of the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, and Og himself seems to prove. The flood reduced the contamination, but it didn't erase it, and that changes everything. Because if the first judgment didn't fully cleanse the earth, then the final judgment, the one described in Revelation, becomes even more necessary. 2 Peter 3:6-7. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment. The first purge was water, and it left survivors. The second purge will be fire, and scripture makes it clear, nothing will survive that. Og was the last of the Rephaim because God used Israel to finish what the flood started. And when the final judgment comes, there will be no giants clinging to the outside of anything, no hybrids hiding in the shadows, no contaminated bloodlines slipping through the cracks. Total, final, complete. So here's what we know for sure. Og existed. The Bible names him, describes his bed, records his cities, documents his defeat. The rabbis say he survived the flood by making a deal with Noah and clinging to the ark from the outside. Whether you take that literally or symbolically, the truth underneath is undeniable. Something from the pre-flood world made it into the post-flood era. The giants reappeared, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim. All of them show up in scripture after the event that was supposed to destroy them, which means the contamination that caused the flood in the first place never fully died. It was suppressed, reduced, pushed to the edges of the map, but it survived until God gave Israel a mission: finish the job, wipe out the giant races, eliminate the last traces of Nephilim corruption from the promised land. And they did. Og was the last. And when Moses killed him, that chapter finally closed. But the story refuses to stay buried, because it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What else survived that we've been told was destroyed? And maybe more importantly, are we living in a world that's truly been cleansed, or are we still dealing with echoes of that ancient corruption? If this shook something loose, if you're starting to see the Bible as darker, stranger, and more specific than you were taught, then don't stop here. Subscribe. Turn on notifications, because every week we're digging into the passages they skip in church. The verses that don't fit the sermon, the details that didn't make it into the Sunday school version. Leave a comment. Did you know Og survived the flood? The giants are gone, but the evidence is still here.